as a way to solve the problems the world is facing. There are, in some cases, growing autocracies, increasing nationalism, perhaps even a decline in the democratic space that we've come to enjoy over the last few decades in some countries and regions. We're also seeing from the feedback that in many places, adherence to the basic rights and norms that govern how we relate to each other and between ourselves and governments is weakening too. And all of this results in a growing dissatisfaction on the part of many people in the world. Dissatisfaction with growing inequality, with the sharp increase in poverty that we've seen over the last few months, but also a dissatisfaction with a feeling that the voices of citizens aren't being heard as loudly and as well as they ought to be. Trust in governments and in institutions overall seems to be declining in many parts of the world. And there is a sense that we lack the kind of leadership we require that puts the collective interests of our humanity and also the planet on which we live at the center of decision making. At the same time, we are seeing major trends like digitalization and the growth of technology significantly impacting the way the world evolves. This provides tremendous opportunities, much greater access to information, much more seamless connection, much more seamless commerce and transactions. But it also poses a number of challenges, for instance, around the digital divide, the gap between those who have access to seamless online platforms and capacities and those who do not. And also a divide that's being exacerbated in many cases by the amplifying effects of digital platforms. The role of social media in spreading disinformation, and in exacerbating the distrust and inequalities that people are facing. Also, at a broader sense, the fear or concern around the impacts that artificial intelligence and new technologies may have on jobs, on human potential, and also on the way in which our economies will evolve over the next few years. A range of ethical and technological challenges that calls out also for a stronger shared governance framework for these kinds of technologies. Underpinning all of this, there was a very clear sense that the climate emergency and the compounding series of ecological and environmental challenges we face are the big existential crises looming in our collective background. We're all familiar with the trends of the climate emergency, and there is a strong sense that we are not doing enough to be able to respond to it, that the scope and scale of that challenge almost risks being pushed into the background by more immediate crises such as COVID. And beyond the climate pandemic, a growing realization as well that the ecological collapse we're seeing in many parts of the world is a deep signal of a much greater systemic challenge we will face in the world to come. At the same time, within countries and communities, there is growing conflict. Nation-state conflict, societal conflict, conflict along political, ethnic, religious minority lines. We're seeing a greater fragility in the social structures in many parts of the world. A sense that in many places, societies, countries are at risk of collapsing much more rapidly than they had in the past, even in places such as middle-income countries, where for a long time, the sense was that they were sufficiently stable to be able to weather most shocks. A growth of violent extremism, radicalization on ethnic, religious, and political lines is evident, and all of these threaten the rate at which development can happen in many parts of the world. Many of these challenges stem from a set of unresolved issues that are very relevant to the development space. The crises of governance, the need to be able to evolve much more inclusive ways of governing societies, inequalities across multiple dimensions, whether it's gender, ethnicity, religion, etc. The loss of social safety nets and the loss of social cohesion that's being felt deeply in many places, reflected also in income inequalities, health disparities, etc. COVID has been a compounder as well as an amplifier of many of these trends. It has been a shock that has exposed many of the structural weaknesses and gaps that we've been discussing. and provides both a tremendous global challenge, but also an opportunity to be able to rebuild out of this crisis in a way that is more inclusive and sustainable and resilient. In the short term, though, in the years to come, the impacts on jobs, on supply chains, on global trade, transport, connection will be profound. And the costs in human loss, the loss of lives, the long-term health impacts are also significant and cannot be underestimated. COVID pandemic and the shock that it's resulted in seems to have brought us closer towards tipping points, the small moments, the small changes that can shift structures in quite profound ways. It's not clear yet what all of these tipping points may be, but certainly we are seeing some in our political and social discourse, where people are rediscovering the need and the opportunity to build more inclusive, more resilient ways of living amongst ourselves. It's also potentially creating some tipping points that are opportunities in the climate and environmental space. For instance, the short-term reduction in carbon emissions over the last few months gives us the breathing room in which to be able to build more carbon neutral and carbon positive economic systems. The decline in international air travel has given us a space to rethink the way and the speed in which we connect and communicate around the world. And the investments that are needed to create jobs and rebuild economies out of COVID are also providing opportunities to build more energy efficient infrastructure, to build more sustainable and renewable energy, to perhaps use job creation and economic stimulus packages as a way to rebuild infrastructure and to provide more sustainable jobs for people around the world. The shift in the nature of how we work will also be profound. The tremendous widespread move towards telecommuting, remote schooling, and the provision of a range of services and government capacities through digital means has accelerated the rate at which digitalization, again, is changing the way in which we live and work. In spite of the many challenges that we're facing, we also see in this longer term trend some positive signals. The way in which communities, individuals, countries have come together to respond to the crisis, the way in which the activism and the protests on the streets are now morphing in many places into a much more structured engagement with the systems, processes, and capacities of governance. The realization that governance is a collective shared endeavor is becoming stronger in many places. And we are seeing some progress continue to be made on the SDGs in many places. Overall, though, we see over the next 5 to 10 years an uncertain future, a world of much greater complexity and a world of much greater diversity, within which we will need to evolve quite different ways to be able to build a sustainable human future. So in that space, what is the role for an organization like UNDP? Very strongly, the feedback we received was that we as an organization need to recommit to pursuing a rights-based, human-centered agenda, one that builds human security, human resilience. There was strong support for us to focus on greener economies, on better public service delivery, including supporting countries on universal access to healthcare, education, etc. Very importantly, to strengthen governance institutions, to help countries and communities build the trust and social cohesion that's required to be more resilient in the future. There was a sense that the world needs new forms of social contracts, new ways beyond the immediate forms and structures of democracy to be able to weave together collective, national, community level, and global level constructs that remind us that we're all in this together. There was an ask for a much stronger environmental vision in how we do development, to be able to provide pathway, a view of how the world could evolve in a more sustainable direction. There was also a strong focus on the issues around conflict. doubling down our efforts on prevention and supporting peace building processes as we do every day around the world. Responding to the challenges of multilateralism, there was an ask for UNDP to become a stronger advocate and exemplar of what the value of multilateralism could be. To be able to demonstrate that structures, networks like this are absolutely necessary in order to be able to create the world we need and to be able to deal with the collective global challenges that we face. And there was also an ask for an organization that would be better in sharing lessons, in building capacities in countries, communities, and governments around the world by providing access to the wealth of experience, insight, and lessons that are being generated by peer communities and countries in other places. For UNDP to be a stronger connector of the dots, to become a platform through which people could find each other and build collective action, and to be able to convene a space where the key elements of sustainable human development are reinforced and reiterated. And in doing all of this, what are the key outcomes that all of you felt we needed to focus on? First and foremost, to redouble our focus on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. With a decade to go to be able to achieve this vision, there was a strong sense that we needed to restate our commitment to the 2030 agenda, despite the short-term challenges that we faced, despite the setbacks in those targets and indicators that we've seen over the last year or two. There was also a sense that within the 2030 agenda, we need to be able to create a reinvigorated view of what development is and of how development as a sector, as an aspiration, could provide a North Star and a guidepost for how we all work together collectively. To underpin that, there was also a healthy discussion about the need for new metrics for development, new ways of measuring progress that go beyond the traditional metrics of GDP, that go beyond a traditional focus on quantifiable outcomes on individual SDG goals and targets, but also that allow us to capture a more human-centered development aspiration. What it means to have a harmonious, sustainable development vision within planetary boundaries, strongly embedded within collective rights and leaving no one behind. These are metrics that should focus not only on governments' systems of planning and budgeting as they do now, but also embed within those much more strongly an accounting of how we are using the limited capacities of our planet, humanity's finite resources in a way that is most efficient and most equitable. And building on that, a need also to diversify the way in which development is underwritten, to be able to find and mobilize more diverse sources of funding beyond the government and intergovernmental resources that is primarily what drives development today. We need to find and build financing for much more systemic level transformations, to move beyond the very projectized or programmatic approaches that we have now, and to be able to mobilize resources for the kind of deep systems transformations that the world requires. This includes working with the private sector, the finance sector, but also developing innovative mechanisms to mobilize local financing at local and regional levels, and to build a set of service offerings that could unlock the kind of financing that is required at multiple levels. So, in order to achieve this goal, what do we need to rethink? What do we need to refocus on in terms of our overall mandate and our programming? What we do on the ground on a day-to-day basis? Firstly, and very importantly, there was a strong call for UNDP to recognize and embrace the complexity and uncertainty in the world today. And building out of this, to realize that we need to continue our move away from a focus on individual projects, point interventions, towards a stronger focus on portfolios that embrace a diversity of approaches to be able to build capacities for systems thinking and transformative change in the way that the world requires. We have already started to work down this way, which many of you acknowledge. building much higher profile systemic interventions like the climate promise, our approach to supporting governments on addressing the 2030 agenda as an integrated systems problem, and others that are evolving at the moment. Within the crisis context, in the countries and communities that we are supporting to survive and get out of crises and conflict, this is expressed in a stronger focus on resilience and on building the resilience capacities of countries and communities themselves to be able to absorb shocks. To do this requires not just new tools, but also very different behaviors and mindsets on the part of ourselves, our staff, but also the partners we work with and those who endorse, underwrite, and finance our work. So this requires a stronger focus on our own internal systems transformation, our human capacities, as well as the tools and approaches that we bring to development. There was also a discussion around UNDP's own mandate and the fact that having a broad development mandate can be both a challenge, as it has been for many years, but also an opportunity, because within that broad development mandate lies the ability to be able to take a holistic systems transformative view of development that not many other organizations are in a position to do. Building on this, using this broad mandate and the necessity of that broad mandate as the foundation on which to build a much stronger systems transformation view of development is a huge challenge, but also a massive opportunity. At the same time, we continue to struggle with the fact that our broad mandate provides challenges in terms of how we define our brand. As an organization that works on systems, on institutional capacities, and on a range of broad interventions across a diverse array of sectors, there is a sense that UNDP's brand proposition, and hence its recognition and value in the world, needs to be more clearly articulated. That the role of being a systems integrator, of being the organization that is able to take a broad interconnected view of development challenges, needs to be framed and conveyed in a clearer and more compelling way, so that those we work with, those who support us, those who underwrite us, have a better intuitive sense of the value that UNDP brings. This is very much the case within the SDG agenda, where our ability to work on the interconnections across a range of SDG goals and targets is a tremendous asset if we leverage it right. But we need to articulate that more strongly in our offering and our brand, and be able to provide the tools and solutions that unlock and make visible how the interconnected challenges are being addressed. We can do this more effectively by leveraging digital tools, by improving our analytics, by being able to move more systematically away from a collection of individual projects to portfolios that tackle systems in an integrated way, rather than sectors or themes on a case-by-case basis. But also, to be able to have an impact at systemic levels, we need to become much more effective at advocacy, at being able to articulate challenges and mobilize others to work with us at a large scale to be able to tackle them. We have strong experience in this area already, and we do a tremendous amount of work on the ground, but there is much more that can be done to link our advocacy potential back to the big challenges that we face in the world. There was also a recognition that the work that we have already done to build more innovative capacities, to be able to look at solutions in non-obvious ways, be able to find and scale solutions from the bottom up, as we're doing with our accelerator labs, etc., is a tremendous asset and one that we should build on in the future. That UNDP has the capacity to become a networker and a repository of ideas that will enable governments and communities to unlock the systems challenges that they face. Within UNDP, this calls for a much stronger focus on agile multidisciplinary teams that can look at problems from a systems perspective, and also the systems and structures and management capacities that allow such teams to operate effectively. And externally, we also need to build a much more diverse set of partnerships to be able to bring in non-obvious and non-traditional partners with skill sets, capacities, and resources that are required to be able to tackle the kind of systemic challenges that we're talking about today. Underpinning all of this, there was a deep discussion also about the operating system, as we call it, of UNDP, the capacities, structures, policies, approaches that underpin our substantive programmatic offering. There was a very clear message that this next strategic plan period needs a bold reset in our overall operating system, one that is based on a model of development assistance that dates back more than 50 years now, and underpinned by a financing model that is also now seen as being less than adequate for the challenges of the future. So this bold asset means building an institutional structure and operational capacities that are far more agile and responsive than they are today. To also be able to attract, mobilize, motivate a much more diverse, a much more gender balanced workforce around the world. Because diversity is a tremendous asset when dealing with complex systems problems. We need to find ways to imbue within our staff and our systems a much stronger transformational and creative mindset, to find and encourage people who are curious, who are willing to take risks in an informed way, and who have a deep attachment to continued learning as they explore how we deal with the range of challenges we face in the world today. And for that, we also need a much stronger set of capacities and culture around knowledge, how we find it, how we manage it, how we transact it, how we monitor the results of what we're doing, and how we as an organization learn from what is happening on the ground. To become a learning organization, to become an organization that is deeply embedded within a culture of knowledge will be absolutely critical for the kind of challenges we see in the world. And all of this requires a constant reflection on evolution of our own internal culture, particularly on the part of leadership, to be able to interrogate what kind of an organization we want, what are the values and norms that underpin what we do, and how do we express those values and norms in the way we behave, in the way we relate with each other, and the way in which we manage and lead an organization. And last but not least, a very different focus in how we mobilize resources. To move away over time from the fact that the vast majority of our resources are being mobilized and delivered through individual specific projects, to be able to build a resource base that is much deeper and more flexible and that allows us to tackle the kind of creative unknown challenges the world ahead of us provides. So colleagues, that was an overview of the main challenges and opportunities that we are seeing. I thank you for your patience as we've gone through this. I see we now have already quite a number of questions and comments coming in. We will not, unfortunately, have a lot of time to be able to take questions or engage in a conversation at this point. However, I will take a look now in the Q&A box and see whether there are any questions coming in that myself or colleagues who are part of this process are able to answer. As we get into this, I also want to take a moment to thank and pay tribute to the small team of colleagues and friends who moderated these discussions for us. Isabel San Malo from Panama, Aisata Day, Steliana Najera, Luciana Mermet, and Sophie Kenkazi, who worked with me to moderate various weeks of both the internal and the external conversations. This was a tremendous challenge, and every single one of you put in a huge effort to be able to connect, respond, reflect on the inputs that we got from all our friends and colleagues. So on behalf of our own core team, huge thanks to all of you and a great recognition for the work you've done in shepherding this conversation forward. Let me now drop into the Q&A, and together with the rest of the team, we will see what questions they may be coming in here that we're able to answer. I'll just pause for a minute while we do that. Thank you. couple of questions already coming in. Camilla, you were asking about whether we have an overview of who has provided input. Yes, we do. On SparkBlue, we have a full listing of everyone who contributed. And also on the SparkBlue platform, we can go back and find individual comments and responses from staff overall. We are not proposing at this stage to publish a full list of everyone who contributed. However, we do have the internal analytics that we can share if needed, if there are particular questions there that you'd like to have answered. Faisal Effendi was asking, what are the three big differences between the present strategic plan and the suggested direction emanating from this global conversation? Thanks, Faisal. It's a very good question. Now, as you're probably aware, and I think it's important to ensure that all of us, particularly our external friends and partners, are aware of this, the process of actively designing the next strategic plan begins at the start of 2021. We undertook and are undertaking this current conversation as a way to get a better shared understanding of what the world ahead of us looks like, what the key challenges and opportunities might be, and in a sense, to be able to paint the landscape or backdrop within which we will then design the strategic plan. In our conversations with many leaders and our external partners, there was a strong sense that given how complex the world is at this point, we all needed to start from some form of a shared understanding of what the next few years would look like, so that we could then use that as a shared understanding on which we discuss how the new strategic plan will be built. Now, with that caveat, differences that we're seeing at this point, certainly, as I mentioned in the presentation a moment ago, a very strong sense that if UNDP is to continue on the trajectory that we've set out in our current strategic plan, to become a much more bold, innovative systems transformation type organization, then we need to explore more deeply the internal transformations that are needed. Our systems, our structures, our capacities, our funding model, our programming model, to lay a strong foundation to be able to build on the work that's been done over the last few years already. I wouldn't be able to give you three specific differences, but I would say that focus on systems, that focus on complexity, and the recognition that we need a focus in our strategic plan as much on how we operate as on what we operate on is quite key. Charlie was asking, hi Charlie, how are we I'm going to try and say that word again. How we are envisioning the bold reset we talked about. Well, I guess at this point, Charlie, the sense from this conversation and from many other conversations within and outside UNDP is that we have operated over the last few decades with an operational model that was designed for a very different era and a very different set of problems. And while we have done tremendous work to be able to iterate, fine-tune, improve that model as we've gone along, there does come a point, and that point is likely to be very soon, when we need to start interrogating the fundamental underpinnings of that model. Now, this ranges across everything from our funding and financing structure to the way in which we organize, manage, motivate, develop our staff, to the underpinning systems and policies around finance, human resources, and particularly the implications of digital across all of this, and the way in which we recognize, encourage, motivate intelligent risk-taking and creativity beyond just traditional delivery. So these are some of the kind of questions that we're looking at. And as you said in your comment, Charlie, certainly very necessary and a space where we're hoping to be able to have more conversations as we go forward. Hi, Ido. There's a question from you about the sequencing on what steps we'll go through to develop the SP. And you're saying that you feel there's a need to include the financial and business model as soon as possible and not to make it an afterthought. Absolutely. So for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the UNDP strategic planning process, we've traditionally had two major elements to it, one being the strategic plan itself, and the other being the underpinning integrated resource framework and budget. Now, in the past, these two have perhaps not been as deeply interconnected as they need to be. This time around, there's already been a conversation with our colleagues working on the different elements of this to make sure that the two are much more closely synchronized, and that we also look at how we need to reframe perhaps the way in which our resource and financial models are being developed as we get into this next strategic plan. So there's likely to be both some immediate recommendations made on how we can improve our current financial and business model, but also possibly a process during the next strategic plan period where we interrogate this more deeply, do further research and consultations, and see whether we can evolve to quite a different funding and business model in the years to come. Sega was asking if we see any convergence or divergence of views between the two parallel tracks of conversation, the one that is external and the one that was internal to UNDP only. Sergey, my own very personal sense on this is I think the conversation that was internal only, in many ways, I guess, went into more detail because we knew we were speaking to peers who spoke the same language and interrogated probably the internal operating system questions slightly more than the external did. But that's just a very superficial and personal reflection of what I was seeing in those two sets of conversations. Got a question here from Raquel, and sorry, many questions coming in, so I'll try and take as many of them as I can. Question here from Raquel. I personally think that the silent revolution of last decades is one led by women and by women's organizations everywhere. I see gender equality as the future and precondition for any deep and bold reset. What do you think about UNDP taking a stronger role delivering a feminist future? Are we ready internally? Well, Raquel, I guess that's a question you're as well placed to answer as I am, if not better. Certainly in the conversations, a number of elements around both gender equality as well as gender empowerment and feminism did come up. In the external, I know in some places there was a recognition, and this has been discussed in many different contexts, that we were seeing a sense of governments and countries that were led by women, in some respects, being better placed to respond to complex crises like COVID. We certainly have a sense within the organization that we need to continue our journey of becoming more gender equitable, but also that we have the opportunity to take a feminist perspective and apply that to a range of development challenges as a way in which we deal with, rights, inclusion, intersectionality, etc. So I also want to pass on to my colleague Dara, who I think wanted to come in on that question as well. Dara?
No, JD, sorry, that was a mistake, but go ahead.
Okay, no problem. Margaret Jones-Williams. Hi, Margaret. With the complexity of the impact of COVID and the definition of new ways of working being observed, will UNDP's business model be adjusted to reflect this? Yes, we certainly hope so. As mentioned just now, there's already a strong sense from these consultations that many people, both within and outside UNDP, feel the need for our underlying business model to be a topic of conversation. That a traditional business model that is, if I were to oversimplify, dependent on ODA transfers from one group of countries to another to underpin development is not really the kind of thing that's going to take us into the long-term future. And that a funding model that is heavily dependent on individual projects rather than being able to invest in larger scale transformations is also suboptimal. So we certainly hope that we'll have a chance to be able to open that conversation with our partners and friends and see what alternatives may be possible. Soledad is asking, in the new SP, what is pictured or highlighted in terms of our role as the integrator of the SDGs in the context of UN reform? So two things for that. I think the need for an organization to take the lead and take on the challenge of providing integrated development solutions to countries and communities in the SDG context is very evident. We are seeing a strong sense that a more integrated perspective and view is needed to be able to support countries and communities as they deal with these challenges. Within the UN development system, that role of being able to provide the tools, capacity, systems to take an integrated view is, I believe, critical. And we're certainly seeing, for instance, with the COVID pandemic, a recognition that being an organization that can connect the dots across health, job creation, digital, government contingency planning, etc., is a value to the UN system that many appreciate. Having said that, it is, I think, a role and a responsibility that is more about our development focus and less about UN reform. There's been, I think, a confusion for a while about our role in providing integrated development solutions, equating to being an integrator of the UN development system. And I think it is important as you go forward to make it clear that it is our role to provide integrated solutions that is the real key need here. Ali Juma was asking, what are the outcomes of feedback we've learned from the current SP and lessons learned that will feed into our new SP? We need to be at the top of the UN when it comes to business model and be the most flexible provider. Couldn't agree more. On lessons from the current SP, Ali, as you know, we have already the midterm review that was undertaken last year and submitted to our board at the beginning of this year. There is a final evaluation of the current strategic plan being undertaken by our independent evaluation office. And we're looking forward to seeing the early results of that by the end of this year. And our colleagues in the COVID-19 Program Response Coordination Group are also starting a lessons learned reflection from our COVID response that we also aim to have feed into the design of the next strategic plan. Recognizing that COVID response, even though it's something that's only been underway for a few months now, is likely to be a key element of our work, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, if not longer. Camilla is asking again, is there a plan to share these findings with our key partners in case they've not participated but may have views at this stage? Yes, Camilla. So beyond this webinar today, which we wanted to use as a way to feed back our initial findings and synthesis, we're also working on a synthesis summary of the many pieces of feedback we received, which we will both post on SparkBlue and also circulate to colleagues as it comes in. Very happy for that to be shared with other partners, including those who did not have a chance to participate in this conversation. And we will be building more opportunities to engage with our partners and networks as we get into the design of the strategic plan process itself. So yes, there will be many opportunities to continue that conversation, I hope. Christina Yanovska sorry, Christina, has an interesting question. She's saying, as a development practitioner, I've observed some steady decline of UNDP's relevance by governments where we are serving. How is this SP addressing this challenge, and how are we open to opening up such discussions with governments? Interesting point, Christina. I think this sense that UNDP's relevance changes, I wouldn't say perhaps declining, maybe I'm an optimist, but that our relevance is changing in different contexts is, I think, quite visible. And for instance, if you look in particular at our work in middle income countries, in order for UNDP to be relevant in that space, we need to be able to provide a very different set of capacities and solutions, which is much less about service delivery or program delivery, but more about knowledge, insight, being able to grasp more complex, bigger picture problems, and being able to provide the tools and solutions to deal with them. Excuse me. That I think is one of the kinds of challenges that many of these comments in our conversation have alluded to. That the world requires a very different approach to development and a different kind of set of toolkits and skills that we can provide to countries and communities as they become more developed, more sophisticated in their own approach. Now, I certainly hope that as we do that, UNDP's continuing relevance in a variety of countries and contexts will be reiterated. As we start moving into more complex offerings in the innovation space, in the digital space, as we evolve our offerings and how to deal with service delivery, inequality, good governance, etc., we should be evolving in a direction that is of relevance to a range of countries without forgetting the places at which our basic service delivery poverty reduction mandate is so key. But it is a journey. And I think it'll take us a continued effort over many years to ensure that our relevance is maintained as countries continue to develop. Sandy Asumani was asking about the next step. What happens after this series of online consultations? Good question, Sandy. So this is probably a good time to talk about the immediate next steps in the longer term. So this series of consultations we undertook over the past month and a bit was the first step in engaging with our broad constituency around the ideas, challenges that we see in the world. Out of this, and having reflected on what has come out of this series of conversations, we will be convening an internal UNDP reflection starting next week, where we'll ask ourselves, so what does this mean for us? Given the insights that we have gained from these conversations, what are the areas of our development offering that we may need to transform? And if so, how? What are the changes in our operating system in how we work that are needed in order for us to deliver on our future? And what are the successes and failures that we've seen internally that we can build on? That internal conversation, alongside engagements with our executive board through member states, with our senior leadership and others, will, by the end of this year, result in a landscape context paper that we hope lays out a picture of what the main trends and challenges are likely to be over the next few years, not as a prediction of the future, but as a starting point for the conversation about what kind of a role UNDP needs to play in the next strategic plan period, leading up to 2025, where we come into the last 5-year period of the 2030 agenda. So the process will continue beginning of next year as we start looking at the key challenges and issues that we need to do deeper research and thinking on. And ultimately, by about April, May next year, we will start to translate all that thinking and all that input and all that engagement into a draft of the strategic plan that we can share with member states, our staff, and others, hopefully for submission and approval at our executive board meeting in September next year. I'm going through the rest of these as I come along, just to be aware, colleague, that it may not be possible to answer all of these questions as we go through the webinar. If there are any that are left over here that we are unable to reach live in this conversation, we will certainly make sure that we send you a written response as soon as we can. So Rajiv Issa was saying, COVID-19 experience has shown the close interface between risks and development. In spite of being acknowledged in the 2030 agenda, this has yet been advanced as effectively as required. How do we seek to highlight this risk-resilient development nexus more explicitly in the next SP? Interesting question, Rajiv, and I guess part of this will also be through the feedback and ideas that you and our colleagues in the risk and resilience part of our family will be able to provide. Just a couple of quick reactions from my own side. Firstly, there is a strain of thought in many of our conversations about the need for a focus on risk as being a key element of the offering we provide to countries. What does this mean? It means a couple of things. First of all, that there is a recognition that we seem to be entering a period of particular systemic risk around the world. The fact that the COVID pandemic occurred, that an epidemiological shock such as COVID resulted in such significant cascade effects across so many other systems and dimensions, seems to point to a world that is particularly fragile at this point, and therefore a focus on risk and systemic risk being much more necessary. Secondly, there is also a conversation underway about the degree to which UNDP's role should be to help countries avoid the downside losses from risks and shocks, rather than only focusing or primarily focusing on the upside of continued progress. What does that mean? Most of the progress that's been achieved in development on the SDGs and the MDGs before these were clearly achieved by countries themselves, through their own domestic investments, through their own internal efforts, through the work and the diligence of their own citizens and communities. The value added of an international organization like UNDP may be to focus more on the downside risks while governments and communities push the upside potential. And that may mean creating stronger capacities to build risk-informed development perspectives, to build preparedness and anticipatory capacities in governments, which also requires a much stronger future focus, an anticipatory focus rather than a reactive focus. How this translates into our strategic plan and how this translates into the kind of skills and capacities that we're likely to build is precisely the kind of question I think that we all need to discuss and build on together. Faridun Nazriev was saying, it seems to me that UNDP is still most of the time perceived as the sole owner of the SDGs, which should not be the case. Absolutely not. Will the new SP articulate how UNDP will be repositioned to be seen as facilitator and supporter of achieving the SDGs rather than key driver? That's interesting because I think we absolutely should be positioning ourselves as a facilitator and supporter rather than a driver. And if there's a perception being created that we are seen more as a driver, then that would be something that I would find quite concerning. I think, though, Faridun, when you talk about the SDGs and the 2030 agenda, and you talk about an organization that is focused on how the different pieces connect to each other, how the different goals and targets interconnect, that should never be implied as saying this is an organization that sees itself as having responsibility for all the goals and targets. In a sense, if I could frame it in one way, we are saying that UNDP recognizes somebody needs to focus on the connective tissue, not on taking responsibility for all the pieces themselves. And apologies, colleagues, for the ambulance noise in the background, but not to take responsibility for every individual piece, but to be the organization that remains conscious of how these pieces connect to each other and therefore can work with all the other UN organizations, development sector actors, government counterparts who focus on the individual pieces. That focus on that connective tissue and the dependencies and relationships amongst the goals and targets is what we're trying to get better at. And I think you're quite right that we should not imply and it should not be seen as that being that UNDP is seeing itself as responsible for the entire SDG agenda on its own. Commenting here from Rachel Scott, it's fairly long, let me just read it out. One thing we might need to think about is why we are focusing on income status of developing countries to design and deliver our approaches. For example, Lebanon is an upper middle income country, but it is a very fragile society with all indicators trending downwards. Perhaps it would be useful to evolve to an approach that is more focused on contextualized risks and opportunities rather than income status. This would help UNDP remain relevant rather than basing our approach and business model on predefined income leverage packages. Now, this is a point, Rachel, that came up very strongly in both the internal and external consultations. I think there is a pretty clear recognition that a model that focuses the type and scale of our support to countries purely on income levels is no longer fit for purpose. For context, for colleagues who are not from within UNDP, this is both a question of which countries you work in, the implicit assumption being once countries reach a certain developmental status, they no longer need support from an organization like UNDP. But even within the range of what we call program countries, those countries within which UNDP operates, the scale of financial support that's provided and the way in which that funding is delivered depends on income categorization. Low middle income country, middle income country, less developed country, etc. There is a recognition that we need to rethink that precisely because, Rachel, as you say, the correlation between fragility and risk and the potential loss of development progress and income status no longer holds true if it ever did. So it's certainly something that we are seeing very strongly come out of this conversation, and we hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss potential alternatives with our member state partners and others as we go along. Faisal Al-Madani was asking how UNDP thinking is evolving in terms of working with youth to achieve the 2030 agenda after the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in hard-hit countries like Syria and Yemen. Um, Thanks, Basil. I think we are starting to become much more actively engaged in working with youth. We have a number of large-scale programs in the Arab States region, in the Asia Pacific, and elsewhere that are trying to find ways in which we can engage with and mobilize the potential of youth much more effectively. And this perhaps would be a stronger feature in our work in the years to come. I don't know yet. It depends a lot on the conversations that are held internally and the kind of analysis we do. Um, Certainly in countries like Syria and Yemen, not only because of the scale of the challenge there, but because of their relatively young populations in many cases, there are tremendous opportunities to work together better. And I certainly hope that we'll find opportunities to work with you and others like you in the months and years to come. Sergio Novas Tejero is saying, delivering integrated solutions in the UN development system means UNDP should take a relevant role in UN reform at a country level. Instruments or services like the SDG platforms, Accelerator Labs, INFF, etc. UNDP integrated role can be seen as well as a knowledge management facilitator in the UN system and not just a provider of integrated solutions. How does UNDP convene and connect? How does the UNDP's convene and connect the dots role going to be related to UNDP's integrator role in the SPs as member states are asking the UN family to be more effective, efficient, and working better together? Well, Sergio, as you know, the conversation about how the UN family can work together more effectively is underway once again through the QCPR process within the UN system. And we are looking forward to seeing what the results of that are and what guidance member states provide to us in terms of the added value we can provide. On the kind of tools and services that we're developing, the SDG platforms at national and local level, the INFFs, our digital offering, our accelerator labs, we are developing and providing these because we recognize that tools like these are going to be necessary. And we certainly recognize and believe that they work more effectively if they work in concert with the rest of the UN system. So if you look at any one of these individual examples, you will see that UNDP is, I think, getting better now at delivering these in partnership with others. Our accelerator labs work very strongly with other UN agencies in many contexts. Our INFFs are a joint endeavor with other UN agencies as well, and the SDG platform work is a heavily inter-agency process. So I do believe from our side, we're doing better and making a solid effort to work with the rest of the UN system. And I believe that there is a clear recognition within the family of UN development system agencies right now that we have the ability to forge strong networks and partnerships amongst ourselves to be able to tackle a range of problems. You will be seeing within UNDP and other agencies that even at the leadership level, the heads of our agencies are expressing a very strong shared desire for us to work together better. And this is translating into quite a diverse array of new joint programs, partnership structures, and initiatives with, for instance, UNICEF, ILO, the UN Environment Programme, UN Women, and others. So I see that as a very positive sign of progress from within UNDP. And I think across the UN system overall, we're seeing a lot of movements in those directions as well. That role for UNDP to convene and to connect the dots, I think plays very well into being an organization that can support a more integrated approach to development within the UN development system, without, of course, detracting from or contradicting in any way the coordination role and leadership role that the UN resident coordinators have. We have, I think, time for maybe one last one. It's already 11 o'clock on the dot. And there's one remaining question here from Margaret Jones-Williams again. While UNDP's broad development mandate may be seen as a challenge, it is a huge opportunity for UNDP and allows us to remain flexible in being able to address new and emerging issues. COVID-19 has shown UNDP to be a relevant organization in what began as a health crisis. How will the new strategic plan define the space to address new and emerging issues in the bold reset? Great question. I think first and foremost, Margaret, we need the new strategic plan to identify both the need for a space like that and the need for an organization like UNDP to provide solutions in that space. Traditionally, our strategic plans and the plans and strategies of most of the UN or the development system tended to focus on which individual locations, which individual thematic areas do we propose to work in, rather than saying, we need an organization that has the systems, capacities, mindset, and agility to be able to engage on things that emerge out of the interactions of multiple shocks and crises, emergent problems, as and when they come up. COVID-19 is a systemic shock that arose out of a health crisis, as you rightly said. Now, the question, I guess, is what is the next systemic shock that may emerge from what sector, and what impacts is that likely to have across other areas? Does this mean UNDP building capacity in every context? No. Does this mean UNDP becoming a health organization? Absolutely not. But it means building the flexibility in our capacities, in our management structures, in our financing structures, so that irrespective of where the next systemic shock emerges from, we have the ability to deal with its impacts and implications very rapidly. I have to say, I'm actually very proud of how UNDP responded to the COVID-19 crisis. I think we've demonstrated a responsiveness and a flexibility there that many partners have appreciated. And I guess the question for us and the challenge for us is how do we build on that experience to be able to systematize and expand capacities to do this in other contexts and with other crises as they come up. That's what we hope we can start to explore further with the next strategic plan. And certainly we look forward to working with all of you as we're doing so. Colleagues, it's just past 11 o'clock now, so we're a little bit over time. I think we have dealt with all the questions that have come up in the Q&A tab, and thank you to all of you for the comments and the reflections there. I see that there are also some questions in the chat box, which I don't think I'll have time to come to right now, but let's go through those. And as we need to, colleagues, we are happy to reach out to all of you and provide answers bilaterally as well. We will be sharing the presentation as well as the synthesis on the Spark Blue platform. You'll be able to find it there. And as you probably know, if you want to reach out to the team more directly with further comments or questions, there is the strategic plan at undp.org email address you can write to, and we'll try our very best to be able to respond or provide any further information that you may require. Once again, on behalf of all the team, the moderators and others who worked on this, on behalf of all of us in UNDP, thank you very much for the time you've taken to be part of this conversation. We are hoping that you will continue to be part of this conversation with us over the months and years to come. Thank you for the time you've taken to be part of this webinar as well. I hope it was instructive, and I hope that we'll be able to continue this discussion in many different forms. Let me sign off here, and I'll check in quickly with the rest of the team to see whether there are any other questions or housekeeping issues we need to address. Dara, Narwe, anything else?
All good, JD.
All right, colleagues, thank you once again. It's been a real pleasure talking at you for the past hour, and I apologize if this was a monologue, but I hope that we were able to address some of the questions and feedback that we've got, and we're really looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. Have a great week ahead. Signing off from New York now. Thanks and bye.